The match was already between Louis Sawyer's fingers when the door swung open, and everything he thought he was died on the porch. The year was 1882, and the dust of the New Mexico territory had a way of settling into a man's soul, the same way it settled into every crack and crevice of the dry, sun-beaten earth. Louis Sawyer had ridden into the town of Redrock crossing 3 days prior with $40 promised to him, a horse named Cutter, and a job that required nothing more than a can of coal oil and a willingness not to think too hard about what he was doing. He had done worse things for less money. That was what he told himself anyway. That was what he kept telling himself as he rode the 2 miles out to the Abbott homestead on a Thursday evening, when the sky was bruising purple and orange, and the cicadas were screaming in the sagebrush like they knew something was coming. The man who hired him was named Gerald Holt, and Gerald Holt was the kind of man who wore a clean suit in a dirty town and smiled with all his teeth whenever he wanted something from you. He ran the Redrock Crossing Land Cooperative, which was a polite name for a company that bought up land, whether the people on it wanted to sell or not. He had bought out 4 homesteads in the past year alone, and now the Abbott place was the last parcel standing between Holt's land corridor and the new rail spur that the Santa Fe Railway was planning to run through the territory. Whoever owned that parcel when the survey team arrived would be sitting on a fortune. Gerald Holt intended to be that person. Louis had not asked too many questions. He had needed the money. His horse had thrown a shoe outside of Soccer Row, and before that he had lost his wages at a card table in Las Cruces, and before that there had been a whole string of bad decisions stretching back nearly 2 years that he did not care to examine too closely. He was 28 years old and he had nothing to show for it except a scarred right hand, a bedroll, and the particular kind of worn-down emptiness that comes from spending too long doing work a man is not proud of. He was not a killer. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He had never shot a man who had not drawn first. But he had done things in the gray space between right and wrong for so long that the line had grown blurry, and Gerald Holt had found him in that blurriness and put $40 worth of coal oil in his hands. The plan was simple. The Abbott woman had refused every offer Holt had made her. She had been served 2 eviction notices that her lawyer, a man in Santa Fe who charged more than she could really afford, had successfully contested. She had filed a proper homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave her legal standing Holt could not easily break. So he had decided to break her will instead. If her buildings burned, the theory went, she would have no choice but to sell. She would have nowhere to live, nowhere to keep her cattle, and the coming winter would persuade her of what the law could not. Louis had listened to all of this and told himself it was just property, wood and nails. He told himself the woman would be compensated, that Holt would offer her a fair price once she had no other option. He told himself a lot of things during the 2-mile ride out to the homestead, and none of them were quite enough to make him feel good about it, but they were enough to keep him riding. He arrived as the last light was leaving the sky. The homestead was modest but neat, set into a shallow bowl between 2 low hills that broke the wind. There was a main house built of adobe and timber, solid and square, with a covered porch running along the front. Behind it stood a small barn, a chicken coop, a root cellar dug into the hillside, and a garden that was carefully fenced against the deer and the rabbits. Someone had planted climbing roses along the porch railing, and even in the fading light Louis could see they were carefully tended, the canes tied back with strips of cloth against the coming autumn. He had been told the woman would be in town on Thursday evenings. She apparently attended a small Bible study at the Methodist church every week, regular as clockwork. Holt's man in town, a weasel-faced fellow named Denton, had confirmed it that very afternoon. She would be gone. The place would be empty. Louis tied Cutter to a juniper tree 100 yards from the house and approached on foot with the coal oil. He moved quietly through the dry grass, the can heavy in his hand, his heart doing something uncomfortable in his chest that he chose to interpret as nerves rather than conscience. The porch steps were 3 wooden planks, and they did not creak under his boots. He set the coal oil down and reached into his jacket pocket for the box of matches. He pulled one out. He held it between 2 fingers. He looked at the roses tied along the railing. He looked at the solid, square house that someone had built with considerable care. He was still standing there, match in hand, trying to locate whatever part of himself could actually do this, when the door opened. He could not move. She stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand and a book pressed against her chest with the other, and the warm light spilled out around her and touched everything golden, and Louis Sawyer's legs simply stopped working. She was not what he had expected. He had built a vague, useful picture of the Abbott woman in his mind during the ride out, something formless and abstract, a figure rather than a person. And the woman in the doorway demolished that picture immediately and completely. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, several strands of it having escaped to curl against her jaw and forehead. She had a direct, serious face, high cheekbones, a firm chin, dark eyes that caught the lantern light and threw it back. She was wearing a plain blue dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a canvas apron over it, and she was clearly not at all where she was supposed to be, which was the Methodist church 2 miles away. She saw him immediately. Her eyes went to him, then to the coal oil can sitting on her porch, then back to his face. She did not scream. She did not step back. She looked at the match between his fingers, and then she looked at his face again, and the expression that crossed her features was not what he would have expected from a woman who had just found an arsonist on her porch. It was not terror. It was something closer to a terrible, exhausted recognition, as though she had been waiting for exactly this and was simply relieved that the waiting was over. "Gerald Holt sent you," she said. It was not a question. Louis could not speak. He was still holding the match. She stepped out onto the porch and set her lantern down on the railing, next to the roses, and looked at him steadily. Up close she was exactly as real as she had seemed from a distance, and that realness was doing something devastating to the purpose he had ridden out here with. "I was not at Bible study tonight," she said. "I had a headache, so I stayed home." "I can see that," Louis said finally, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped hollow. "Are you going to light that?" He looked down at the match in his hand as though he had forgotten it was there. He looked back up at her. "No," he said, and the word felt like the truest thing he had said in years. Something shifted in her face. She studied him for a long moment, the kind of careful, thorough study that made him feel she was reading something written on him that he could not read himself. "Then you had better come inside," she said, "and tell me everything." He left the match on the porch railing. He left the coal oil can where it sat. He followed Annie Abbott through her door, and that was the beginning of the whole rest of his life, though he would not have believed it if someone had told him so. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. There was a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a cast iron stove against the far wall, shelves lined with canned goods and books in equal measure, a braided rug on the floor, and a bedroom doorway hung with a curtain made of patchwork cloth. It was a home in the fullest sense of the word, lived in and tended and loved, and Louis felt the wrongness of what he had almost done settle into his gut like lead. She pointed at one of the chairs. He sat. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set one in front of him, then sat across the table with her hands wrapped around her own cup, watching him. "Talk," she said, and he did. He told her all of it, Gerald Holt, the $40, the coal oil, the plan. He told her about the land corridor and the rail spur and Holt's lawyer and the eviction notices. He told her more than she probably already knew, and she listened to all of it without interruption, her dark eyes steady on his face, and when he was finished she was quiet for a moment. "I know about the rail spur," she said. "I have known for 6 months. It is why I hired a lawyer in Santa Fe. It is why I have not moved." "You know your claim is solid," Louis said. "I know my claim is solid," she agreed. What I did not know was that Holt would go this far. She looked at her coffee. I suppose I should have. He is that kind of man. Yes, Lewis said. He is. She looked back at him. And what kind of man are you? It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. He turned his scarred right hand over on the table and looked at it. I have been asking myself that question for a while, he said. I am not sure I like the answer I have been coming up with. She was quiet again for a moment. The stove ticked in the warm room. Outside, a night bird called once and fell silent. What is your name? She asked. Lewis Sawyer. Annie Abbott, she said, as though they were meeting at a church social and not across her kitchen table after he had nearly burned her house down. She extended her hand over the table and he took it, and her grip was firm and her palm was calloused from work, and he held her hand for exactly 1 beat longer than a handshake required before he let go. You are not going to shoot me, he said. It was an observation, not a question. I have a rifle, she said pleasantly. I am still deciding. He almost smiled. It surprised him so much that he pressed his lips together and looked at the table to compose himself. I am not going back to Holt, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever I tell you tonight, whatever you need me to do or not do, I am not going back to collect that $40. I believe you, she said, and the simplicity with which she said it as though it cost her nothing made something in his chest ache unexpectedly. You should not trust me so easily, he said. You do not know me. No, she agreed, but you left the match on the railing. He had no answer for that. She refilled his coffee without asking if he wanted it, and they sat at her kitchen table until well past midnight while she told him about the homestead. How she had come to New Mexico from Missouri 2 years prior, alone, after her parents died of typhoid fever and her older brother sold the family farm, and moved to Colorado without a word of invitation to her. She had been 22 years old with $200 in savings, a trunk of belongings, and a determination that she described in a flat, matter-of-fact tone that told him it had cost her considerably more than she was letting on. She had filed her claim under the Homestead Act, which gave a settler 160 acres of public land in exchange for 5 years of residency and improvement. She had built the adobe house with help from a neighboring Mexican family, the Rodriguezes, who lived 4 miles to the east and had become her closest friends in the territory. She had broken ground on 30 acres, planted crops the first year, added cattle the second. She was a year into her 5-year prove-up period and could not leave or she would lose everything. Gerald Holt made his first offer 8 months ago, she said. It was insultingly low. I told him so. He sent a man back with a higher number. I told him the land was not for sale at any price. She met Lewis's eyes across the table. This is my home. I built it. I am not leaving it. The conviction in her voice was not anger or bravado. It was something quieter and more final than either, the kind of certainty that a person reaches after they have already survived the worst of something and discovered they are still standing. Lewis recognized it the way you recognize a language you do not speak but have heard enough to understand a few words of. He is going to try again, Lewis said. Not the same way, but he will try. $40 buys you a lot of men in this territory. I know, she said. She was not frightened by this, or at least she did not show it. She pressed her lips together and looked at the wall for a moment, thinking. I can help you, Lewis said, and the words came out before he had fully decided to say them. She turned her eyes back to him, and they were direct and careful and not unkind. Why would you do that? She said. He thought about it honestly. Because I nearly burned your house down, he said, and because I think I would like to do something I am actually proud of for once. The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the lantern flame moved between them in the draft from under the door. I have a barn, she said at last. There is a sleeping stall that is empty. You can sleep there tonight, and tomorrow morning you can tell me what you know about Gerald Holt's operation, and we will figure out what to do from there. That is more than fair, he said. Do not make me regret it, she said, and stood up from the table and carried her cup to the dry sink. He slept in the barn that night on a pile of clean straw with Cutter warm and breathing in the stall beside him, and he stared up at the dark rafters where the swallows nested and thought about the match he had left on the porch railing, and the particular way the lantern light had moved in her dark eyes, and the climbing roses tied along the railing with strips of cloth, and he did not sleep for a very long time. In the morning she made biscuits and eggs and set them on the table without ceremony, and he ate across from her in the early light that came through the east-facing window and turned everything pale gold. She asked him precise, intelligent questions about Holt's operation, who worked for him, how many men he kept on the payroll, where his offices were, whether he had any relationships with the county sheriff that might interfere with a legal complaint. Lewis answered everything he knew, which was a fair amount given that he had spent 3 days in Red Rock Crossing listening to Holt and his associates talk without being careful about who was in earshot. The sheriff, a man named Colburn, was on Holt's payroll in the informal but effective way common to many frontier towns, not paid directly, but benefited consistently in ways that encouraged his cooperation and discouraged his scrutiny. This was the first obstacle Annie had already identified. "My lawyer in Santa Fe is a man named Patterson," she said, spreading butter on a biscuit with focused precision. "He has been preparing an injunction against Holt's attempts to invalidate my claim, but he has been slow, and I think he is also somewhat afraid of Holt's connections." She set the knife down. "What I need is evidence, not just my word, but something concrete, something Holt cannot explain away." "He paid me in cash," Lewis said. "No contract, no letter." "That is how he does it," she said. "He is careful." "There is a man named Denton," Lewis said, and she looked up sharply. "Weasel-faced, drinks at the Red Rock Saloon. He is Holt's errand man. He knows everything. He also drinks too much, and when he drinks too much he talks. You think he would talk to a lawyer? I think he would talk to the right person under the right circumstances," Lewis said. "He does not love Holt. He just needs the money. If someone offered him a better deal, or if someone made it clear to him that the legal danger of his situation outweighed the money Holt was paying him, he might reconsider his loyalties." Annie looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in that direction. "You have thought about this more than one night's sleep would account for," she said. "I thought about it on the ride out," he admitted. "There was a part of me that knew I was not going to go through with it. I just had not admitted it to myself yet." She nodded slowly, accepting this without commentary, and went back to her breakfast. Over the following days, a rhythm established itself at the Abbott homestead that neither of them had planned and neither of them questioned aloud. Lewis helped with the practical work, mending the fence on the south pasture, which had 3 broken posts and a sagging wire, fixing a leak in the barn roof, splitting the wood that was stacked by the back wall of the house and needed to be reduced to a size the stove could use. He was good with his hands, which surprised him, since he had spent so much of the past 2 years being good with other things. Annie worked alongside him most of the time, not deferring and not directing, but simply working with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing everything alone for a long time and had learned to waste nothing, not energy, not material, not time. On the 3rd day, her neighbors came. The Rodriguez family arrived in the mid-morning with a wagon. Ernesto Rodriguez, a compact and careful man in his 40s, and his wife Maria, and their 2 teenage sons, Felipe and young Jorge, who was perhaps 16 and growing like a weed. They had come to help Annie prepare the root cellar for winter storage. Ernesto looked at Lewis with a long, measuring gaze that carried the full weight of a man who had been watching out for a neighbor for 2 years and was not entirely sure about a stranger who had appeared on the premises without explanation. Annie made the introduction simple and honest. "This is Lewis Sawyer," she said. "He came out here on Gerald Holt's business and decided not to do it. He has been helping around the place." Ernesto looked at Lewis. Lewis looked at Ernesto. "Holt's man," Ernesto said, not accusatory, just naming the thing. "His former man," Lewis said. "I did not collect the pay." Something shifted in Ernesto's face. Not trust exactly, but a measured willingness to wait and see. Maria Rodriguez, who had a sharp, kind face and clearly ran the family's opinions as much as its household, looked at Annie with a quick, pointed look that said they would be discussing this later in private. Annie met her eyes with a slight lift of her chin that said she knew it and was at peace with it. They spent the day working together, and Louis noticed that Ernesto watched him throughout, not hostilely, but with the steady attention of a man doing a careful calculation. By the afternoon, when they were rolling the heavy pumpkins down into the root cellar and stacking the dried corn in burlap sacks, Ernesto came and worked beside Louis without comment, and at one point handed him a water gourd without being asked, which Louis took to be a form of provisional acceptance. That evening, after the Rodriguez family had gone, Annie and Louis sat on the porch steps in the cooling air of the late September evening, and she told him about Ernesto's history. He and Maria had farmed this land for 15 years, having received a land grant through the old Mexican territorial system that predated American annexation. When New Mexico came under American governance after 1848, many of the old Mexican land grant holders found their claims contested, their documents disputed, their borders were drawn by men who spoke a different language and operated under a different legal framework. The Rodriguezes had lost 60% of their original grant over 10 years of legal battles. They had kept what they had with great difficulty and at considerable expense. Holt tried to buy them out too, Annie said. 2 years ago, Ernesto told him to leave and came back inside and did not say another word about it for a week. People like Holt count on wearing people down, Louis said. Yes, she said. They are very patient with other people's misery. A nighthawk dove and banked over the darkening pasture, catching insects in the last light. Louis watched it and thought about Gerald Holt sitting in his clean office in Reed Rock Crossing, patient and well-fed, waiting for people to tire of fighting him. I want to go into town tomorrow, Louis said. I want to find Denton. Annie turned to look at him. The evening light was deep and amber, and it lay along the side of her face in a way that made him conscious of where his eyes were going and careful about keeping them properly directed. I want to come with you, she said. That might not be wise, if Holt has men watching. I am not hiding on my own land because Gerald Holt is watching, she said, with the quiet, final tone he was already beginning to recognize as her particular way of ending a discussion. He thought about arguing and decided against it. All right, he said, but stay close. The word sat between them for a moment with a weight it had not quite had before, and Annie looked out at the pasture with an expression that might have meant anything at all, and Louis looked at his hands and told himself firmly to be sensible. They rode into Reed Rock Crossing the next morning. The town was not large, perhaps 400 residents, 2 main streets crossing at right angles, a post office, a general store, a land office, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, a livery, a church, and a scattering of private residences. The Reed Rock Land Cooperative's office occupied a prominent corner building with glass windows and a painted sign. Louis made a point of not looking at it as they rode past. He found Denton at the smaller of the 2 saloons, the Lucky Strike, which opened its doors at 10 in the morning to accommodate the particular clientele that required it to. Denton was sitting at the bar with a glass of whiskey and the specific air of a man who has nothing to do and is not happy about it. He was small and narrow-shouldered, with a pinched face and restless hands that moved constantly on the bar top as if looking for something to hold on to. Louis came up beside him and sat down, and Denton went very still. Sawyer, Denton said, in a tone that was trying to be easy and failing. Denton, Louis said, the job did not go as planned. Denton's eyes moved to the door. I heard. What did you hear? I heard you did not do it. A pause. Holt is not pleased. I imagine not. Louis ordered a coffee from the barman and waited for it. How much did Holt pay you to watch the Abbott woman's schedule and tell him when she would be away? Denton's hand stopped moving on the bar. I do not know what you're talking about. "Denton," Lewis said patiently, "I was hired by the same man who hired you, and I know exactly what your role was. I'm not asking to accuse you. I'm asking because I want to know how deep you are in this and whether you want a way out." A long silence. Denton picked up his glass and set it down without drinking. "He paid me $12, Denton said very quietly, "to watch her schedule and report it. I have been doing it for 3 months. $12, Lewis said. "I needed the money." "I know." Lewis turned to look at him directly. "The woman's lawyer in Santa Fe is building a legal case against Holt. They are going to need evidence of specific intent to harm and intimidate. Your testimony, what you saw, what you were paid to do, what instructions you were given would be exactly what they need." Denton's face went through several expressions in quick succession. "If I testify against Holt in this town, I am finished. He will see to it. If Holt is successfully prosecuted, he will not be able to see to anything," Lewis said. "His lawyer connections in Santa Fe are not as solid as he makes them sound. I spent 2 days listening to him in his office. His Santa Fe man is a political appointee who will drop a client the moment the risk outweighs the benefit. Holt's power depends on Holt staying free and solvent." Denton stared at his glass for a long moment. "There is more," he said quietly. "I have letters. He had me carry letters to his man in Santa Fe about the Abbott property, about the plan to force her out. I kept copies." A pause. "I kept copies of everything. I have been keeping copies since I started working for him because I knew someday this would go wrong." Lewis looked at him steadily and felt a cautious hope uncurl in his chest. "Where are these letters?" he said. "In my room at the boarding house. In the lining of my traveling bag." Lewis stood up and put $2 on the bar. "Can you come with me to the boarding house and give them to me now?" Denton looked at the $2 and at the door again and at Lewis. "What happens to me after? If Patterson can use your testimony and the letters to make the case, you leave town with a clear conscience and whatever Holt owes you for the last month of work, which I imagine he has not paid given what happened. You start over somewhere else." It took Denton approximately another minute of staring at his whiskey before he stood up from the bar stool. They went to the boarding house. Lewis stood in the doorway while Denton dug through the traveling bag at the back of his closet shelf and extracted a thin packet of folded papers. Lewis read through them quickly. They were exactly what Denton had described. Letters in what appeared to be Holt's hand or dictated by Holt to a clerk, discussing the Abbott property in explicit terms that included references to removing the occupant by whatever means necessary, and ensuring the land was cleared before the railway survey in November. He brought the letters back to Annie, who was waiting outside the general store with both horses. When he handed them to her and she read the first page, he watched her face go from composed to something much harder and much more controlled than anger, the kind of expression a person wears when they have been proved right about something they deeply wish they were wrong about. "He put it in writing," she said. "He trusted his clerk to keep a file and his errand man not to keep copies," Lewis said. "He was wrong on both counts." "We need to get these to Patterson in Santa Fe," Annie said. "Yes, and soon. Holt will notice that Denton is gone and that the job never got done, and he will start looking at other options. The November survey is not far off." "I can ride to Santa Fe," she said immediately. "The road is 4 days," he said. "I know the road." "I will go with you," he said, and this time there was no discussion about wisdom or watching, just a look between them that settled the matter. They rode back to the homestead and spent the afternoon preparing for the trip. Annie asked Maria Rodriguez to look in on the cattle and chickens while they were away, explaining the situation in full. Maria listened with her arms folded, and her expression growing steadily darker as the details accumulated. And when Annie finished, Maria said several things in Spanish that required no translation for Lewis, even the parts he could not entirely follow. "You take care of her," Maria said to Lewis in English, looking at him with the directness of a woman who has been taking care of other people for 20 years and knows exactly what it requires. "Yes, ma'am," Lewis said. They set out before first light the next morning. The road to Santa Fe crossed through 60 miles of high desert terrain scrub flats, arroyos, the long climb into the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and then the descent into the city. In 1882, the Santa Fe Trail itself was increasingly being supplemented by the railway line, but the Abbott homestead sat away from the rail line, and the road journey was unavoidable. They traveled mostly in silence on the first day, not the uncomfortable kind but the easy kind that comes from two people who have discovered they do not need to fill quiet with noise. Lewis noted that Annie rode well. She sat her horse with the relaxed competence of someone who had learned necessity rather than leisure, and she paced herself on the open stretches and gave the horse time on the climbs without having to be reminded. They camped the first night on a sandy bench above a dry creek bed, under a sky so extravagantly full of stars that it seemed almost theatrical. Annie made coffee on a small fire and they sat across it from each other on their bedrolls, and the fire popped quietly between them, and the silence was so complete and so natural that when she spoke it was like something waking up. "Tell me about where you are from," she said. He told her. He was from Kansas originally, a town called Salida, though it did not exist anymore in any meaningful sense. It had been a small farming community that dried up and dispersed when 3 years of bad drought broke most of the homesteaders who had settled it. His father had been one of those broken homesteaders. His mother had died when Lewis was 12, of a fever that a doctor with more resources might have treated. His father had lasted 2 more years and then drunk himself into a ditch, which was not the most dignified end but was at least a predictable one given the trajectory. Lewis had been 14 and had gone to work on a cattle drive heading south because it was the only offer on the table. "I drove cattle for 3 years," he said. "Then I did some freighting. Then some work as a scout for a surveying company, which was honest work and I liked it. But the company folded when the lead surveyor died and his brother, who inherited the business, ran it into the ground inside of 6 months." He poked the fire. "After that it got less organized." Annie was listening with her knees drawn up and her chin resting on them, the firelight moving softly over her face. "Less organized how?" "I did odd jobs," he said. "Some of them were odd in the way that means they required not asking too many questions. I was careful not to hurt people directly." He paused. "That is not as good a standard as I used to think it was." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "I suppose it is not. But you are here." "I am here," he agreed. She looked at the fire. "My brother sold the farm in Missouri," she said, as though continuing a conversation they had been having for years. "He sold it the week after my mother was buried, while I was still staying with our nearest neighbor, Mrs. Clarkson, to get through the first days. He sent me a letter explaining it. He did not ask. He said the farm had debts and the sale was necessary and he was taking his share to Colorado." She picked up a small stick and turned it over in her fingers. "My share after the debts was $430. He sent it in a bank draft. I never saw him again." "I am sorry," Lewis said. "I was very angry for a long time," she said. "Then I came out here and I had too much work to sustain the anger properly, and it turned into something else. Not forgiveness exactly. More like I stopped giving it room." She threw the stick into the fire. "This land is mine because I made it mine. Nobody gave it to me and nobody can take it." He looked at her across the fire, and there was something about the way she said it, not defiantly, not loudly, just with that complete and quiet certainty, that made him feel as though he were watching something very old and very real, the thing that people had always come west to find, that singular insistence on existing on your own terms. "No," he said softly. "Nobody can." She looked up and found him watching her, and neither of them looked away for a moment that was longer than accidental. Then she reached for the coffee pot and asked if he wanted more, and the evening resumed its ordinary shape. But something had shifted in the air between them, settled and deepened, like a river after a flood that has found a new course and knows it. They reached Santa Fe on the afternoon of the 4th day. The city was larger than Red Rock Crossing by a considerable measure, with a long history that showed in its layered architecture. The old Spanish colonial buildings around the plaza, the newer Anglo structures going up alongside them, the whole place wearing its mixed heritage openly and sometimes uncomfortably. Lewis had been here once before, passing through, and he remembered it as a city that had been several different things in succession without fully deciding which one it was going to be. Patterson's office was on a side street off the plaza, in a two-story building shared with a notary and a surveying firm. The lawyer himself was a small, precise man of perhaps 50, with a thinning crown and the careful, hedging manner of someone who has spent his career managing expectations. He received Annie with a professional warmth that Lewis noticed was somewhat warmer than mere professionalism, and he received Lewis with a notably more calibrated look. Annie laid the letters from Denton on Patterson's desk and explained the situation while Patterson read. His expression changed as he read the professional mask slipping to reveal something that was genuinely startled, and then something that was professionally excited in the careful way of a man who has just been handed a much stronger case than he expected to have. "This is Holt's handwriting," he said, holding up one of the letters to the window light. "I have a sample from the correspondence he sent to my office. This matches." "Denton is willing to testify," Lewis said, "provided he is given reasonable assurance of his safety after the fact." Patterson set the letter down and folded his hands on the desk and looked at Annie. "With these letters and a cooperative witness, I can file for a permanent injunction against Holt's Land Cooperative with respect to your property. I can also file a complaint with the Territorial Attorney's Office for criminal harassment and attempted property destruction." A pause. "The latter may be more difficult to prosecute given the political complexities in the territory, but the injunction I can get. And with the injunction in place before the November survey, Holt's claim on the rail spur corridor through your land collapses completely. Without that corridor, the land he has already purchased to either side of yours loses most of its value. Then he loses everything he has been working toward," Annie said. "A very great deal of it, yes." Annie sat back in her chair with the composed look of someone receiving news they had been working toward for a long time and needed a moment to let it fully settle. Lewis watched her from his seat against the wall and felt something in him that was warm and specific, and that he was trying not to examine too carefully in a lawyer's office. "How long?" Annie said. "I can have the injunction filing prepared in 2 days, Patterson said. "The court calendar in the territory is," he made a gesture, "inconsistent, but given the documentary evidence, I am confident the judge will move quickly. 4 to 6 weeks for a hearing, perhaps less." "October, then," Annie said, "before the survey. I will make certain of it." They stayed in Santa Fe 2 nights in a respectable boarding house on the east side of the plaza. On the first evening, after the meeting with Patterson, Lewis and Annie walked around the plaza as the evening cooled and the vendors were packing up their stalls. They moved at the slow pace of 2 people who have nowhere to be and are in no hurry to get there, and the conversation moved between small things and larger ones, with the easy circulation of water finding its level. He told her, because she asked, and he found he wanted to tell her, about the scout work with the surveying company, how he had loved the open country and the practical skill of reading landscape, knowing what a change in vegetation meant for water underground, knowing from the lay of ridgelines where weather would come from. She listened with real interest, asking questions that showed she understood the territory in her own practical way, the way of someone who had been reading landscape for survival rather than occupation. "You would be good at farming," she said, as though following a private train of thought. He looked at her sideways. "What makes you say that?" "You see things," she said simply. "You pay attention to the land, that is half of it. The other half is stubbornness, which I suspect you also have." He did not quite know what to do with that, so he laughed, which was not something he did frequently, and felt somewhat unfamiliar in his chest, like a coat he had not worn in a long time, but that fit better than he remembered. She smiled at him, a full, unguarded smile that was the first truly unguarded thing she had shown him, and he thought he had probably never seen anything quite so worth seeing in all his 28 years in the world. On the second evening, sitting in the small courtyard behind the boarding house where a tiled fountain burbled quietly and the air smelled of wood smoke and roasting chilies, he told her something he had not told anyone in several years, that he was tired. Not physically, though he was often that, but in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the shape of his life for the past several years, the constant motion of it, the rootlessness, the absence of anything he was building or tending or growing. He told her this awkwardly in pieces, not quite looking at her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and he worried he had said too much or the wrong thing, and then she said, "I know that kind of tired." He looked at her. "When I first came to the territory," she said carefully, "I spent the first 3 months working so hard that I did not have to feel it. And then one night I was so exhausted that I could not do anything except sit on the porch in the dark, and I just felt it. All of it. The grief for my parents, the anger at my brother, the fear of what I had taken on." She looked at the fountain. "And then it was over, and I got up in the morning and I planted my garden, and I was still afraid, but I was also present. In the right place." Met his eyes. "I think sometimes you have to be tired enough to stop moving before you can find the place you are supposed to be." He held her gaze for a long moment, and the courtyard was very quiet around them, and the fountain made its small, steady sound, and he said, "I think you may be right about that." And the words carried rather more weight than their surface meaning, and she heard it, and neither of them looked away. He did not say anything more than that. It was not the moment for more than that. But something had been said, and both of them knew it, and they walked back inside through the courtyard doorway in a silence that was different from all the previous silences, warmer, and somehow more resolved. The ride back from Santa Fe took 3 days at a pace more comfortable than the urgent ride out. The weather held clear and cold at night, and they camped both nights under wide, brilliant skies, and the conversation between them had the quality of something that had been formally commenced and was finding its proper dimensions. On the second night of the return, with the fire between them and the horses standing quietly at their picket line, Lewis said, "I want to stay." Annie looked at him. "At the homestead," he said carefully. "If you would have me, I can work. I know livestock and fences and enough carpentry to be useful. I am not asking for," he stopped, organized his thoughts. "I am not asking for anything improper. I am asking to be useful to you and honest with you and to stay in one place for long enough to find out whether I am the man I would like to be." She watched him through the fire for a long moment, and the fire moved between them, and the night was very large and very quiet around them. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "Yes," he said. "And we will see," she said. "Yes," he said again, and the word was enough. They arrived back at the homestead on a cool October afternoon to find Ernesto Rodriguez waiting on the porch with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Lewis did not like. "A man came yesterday," Ernesto said, "looking for you." His eyes went to Lewis. "He knew your name. He said Holt wanted his property back." Lewis went still. "What did he look like?" "Big, red hair. He was wearing a gun low on his left side." "Briggs," Lewis said, and the name tasted like something rotten. He had met Briggs once in Holt's office, briefly, a professional and deliberate man who was several categories above Denton in terms of what he was willing to do for money. "He left," Ernesto said. "But he will be back." Annie stood beside Lewis on the porch, and they looked at each other, and whatever fragile peace they had been building on the return road contracted slightly under the weight of this new information. She did not look frightened, but her jaw set in that firm way it had, the way that meant she was marshaling herself. "He is looking for the letters," Lewis said. "Holt knows they are gone. He knows Denton gave them to someone." "Patterson already has them," Annie said. "Yes, but Holt does not know that." Lewis turned to Ernesto. "How many of the Rodriguez sons are at home right now?" Ernesto looked at him steadily. "Both of them. Would you consider?" "Yes," Ernesto said simply before Lewis could finish the question. "We will stay here." The next 5 days had a particular kind of tension to them, not the explosive kind but the drawn-tight kind, like a bow string held at full draw, everything coiled and waiting. Ernesto and his elder son Felipe took turns keeping watch through the nights, and Louis did not sleep deeply, and Annie went about her work with a deliberate normalcy that he recognized as its own form of stubbornness, a refusal to let Gerald Holt's hired man live in her days any more than she could avoid it. On the third day, Briggs came. He came in the afternoon openly, riding up the road to the homestead without any attempt at concealment. This was a choice. Louis recognized the statement that he did not need to sneak, that his presence was itself the message. He was indeed large and red-haired, with a face that had seen considerable weather, and he wore his gun exactly as Ernesto had described. Louis came off the porch to meet him in the yard, and Annie came out beside him, which he had expected and did not try to prevent. "Sawyer," Briggs said, pulling up his horse. His eyes moved to Annie with a professional assessment that was not hostile but was not warm. "Miss Abbott, you can turn around," Louis said. "I am just delivering a message," Briggs said, in a tone that said delivering messages was not the only thing he was prepared to do. "Holt wants the letters. He is prepared to offer Miss Abbott a fair price for the property and move on if the letters are returned." "The letters are in Santa Fe with my lawyer," Annie said clearly. "They were there before you came looking. There is nothing to return." A silence. Briggs absorbed this with the calm of a man doing a calculation. "That would be Patterson," he said. More silence. "Holt is not going to be pleased about that." "Gerald Holt can add it to his list of disappointments," Annie said. Louis watched Briggs carefully, reading his hands, reading the line of his shoulders. He was not going to draw here, not against two people on their own land with witnesses in the barn. That was not how men like Briggs operated. They were careful about legal exposure, at least in daylight. "I will pass on the message," Briggs said, and turned his horse without haste and rode back down the road. When he had gone, Annie let out a long, slow breath, and Louis realized he had been holding his own breath for approximately the past 3 minutes. "He will not try anything directly," Louis said. "Not with Ernesto and Felipe here, not with Patterson already in possession of the evidence. Direct action would only add to the case against Holt. So we wait," Annie said. "We wait," he agreed. What they were waiting for arrived in the form of a letter from Patterson 3 weeks later, delivered by the postal rider who came through the area twice a week. The territorial court had granted a preliminary injunction against the Raydrock Land Cooperative with respect to the Abbott homestead, pending a full hearing scheduled for the following month. The injunction prevented Holt from taking any action to acquire, encumber, or interfere with the property while the case was pending. The letter also noted that the territorial attorney's office had opened a formal inquiry into the harassment complaint, and that Gerald Holt had retained additional legal counsel in Santa Fe, which Patterson described as a sign that he was worried. Annie read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again, and then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at Louis across it. "It is working," she said. "It is working," he said. The November survey came and went without incident. The railway company's survey team passed through the territory and noted, in their official records, that the Abbott homestead parcel was subject to active litigation and thus could not be acquired as part of the proposed right-of-way corridor. Holt's carefully assembled land corridor had a gap in it that made it legally useless to the railway. This was not the end of Gerald Holt's story, exactly. Men like Holt do not simply fold. But the machinery of his plan had been stopped, and the legal case continued to develop in ways that increasingly constrained him, and the territorial attorney's inquiry added a layer of accountability that made his usual methods dangerous to employ. When the full hearing was held in the territorial court the following January, Patterson presented the letters, Denton's testimony, and a supporting affidavit from Louis himself, and the court issued a permanent injunction against Holt and his cooperative, along with a formal censure and a fine that, while not ruinous, made abundantly clear that the court had found his conduct unacceptable and would be watching. Holt did not go to prison, and Lewis, who had harbored some hope of that outcome, was disappointed but not entirely surprised. The legal system of the New Mexico Territory in 1882 was not fully equipped to imprison men with resources and connections, even when those men had behaved badly. But his land corridor was broken, his railway scheme was dead, and within 6 months the Raydrock Land Cooperative had been quietly dissolved, and Gerald Holt had relocated to El Paso, where he was presumably beginning some new version of the same enterprise on a fresh set of people who did not yet know what he was. Lewis noted this outcome and found that he cared about it less than he expected to, which said something about where his attention had gone. He had been at the Homestead for 4 months by the time the legal case resolved, and in those 4 months something had grown between him and Annie that was by that point entirely clear to both of them and to everyone around them, though it had been stated aloud only in the most careful and incremental ways. He slept in the barn. He worked every day. He was useful with the cattle, more than useful with the carpentry. He had repaired the porch boards, rehung 2 doors that sat crooked, built a proper shelf unit for the east wall of the kitchen, and was partway through framing a second room onto the back of the house, which Annie had mentioned needing, and which Lewis had begun without being asked, and then felt suddenly conscious about, and then been told by Maria Rodriguez in a very direct conversation to stop being foolish and keep building. He was splitting wood in the side yard one afternoon in late November when Annie came around the corner of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and leaned against the woodpile, and they were quiet for a moment in the cold, bright air. "I want to ask you something," she said. He set the axe down and turned to face her. She looked at him directly, the way she always did, with no evasion. "What do you want?" she said. "Not what is useful, not what makes sense practically. What do you actually want?" He looked at her for a long time, and the cold air was very clear and the sky behind her was the particular deep blue of the high desert in late autumn, and he thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I want to stay here," he said, "permanently. I want to build things and tend things and have something to show at the end of a year. I want to be a man who is worth something to people who matter to me." He paused. "I want to be worth something to you." She held his gaze without flinching. "I want that too," she said quietly. "The question is whether we are going to go on being sensible about it indefinitely or whether we are going to do something about it." He put down his coffee cup on the woodpile very carefully. "I have $40 that I never collected," he said. "I have Cutter in my gear. I have no particular prospects except the work I have been doing here, and I have every intention of earning a proper wage for it and not asking for anything I have not built a right to." He stopped. He tried again. "What I am trying to say is that I do not have a great deal to offer you materially, and what I am about to say may be premature, and if it is, tell me plainly and I will step back and wait as long as you need me to." "Lewis," she said, with some patience. "Annie Abbott," he said. "I would like to court you properly, with your consent, and if things go the way I hope they do, I would like to ask you to marry me, and I would like to spend the rest of my life helping you build this place into what you have always meant it to be." The late November light was pale gold, and the woodpile smelled of pine resin, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and she looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and she said, "Yes, Lewis, you may court me." The following months were the best of Lewis Sawyer's life, which surprised him a little and did not surprise him at all. The courtship was conducted in the traditional sense with attention and care, and the kind of gradual, deepening knowledge of a person that comes from working beside them, and talking with them, and watching how they behave toward other people and toward themselves. He brought her wildflowers in October when he found them along the arroyo. He read aloud to her in the evenings from one of her books, which she had many of and which covered a range of subjects that said a good deal about the scope of her curiosity. She brought him coffee in the mornings without being asked, and occasionally, when he was particularly tired from a long day's work, set a hand briefly on his arm or his shoulder, and the brief warm weight of her hand was more sustaining than any amount of sleep. Maria Rodriguez regarded the whole development with an expression of extreme satisfaction, and the occasional remark to Annie in Spanish that made Annie turn a color Louis found entirely charming. Ernesto shook Louis's hand one evening after they had spent a day repairing the Rodriguez family's south pasture fence together, and said simply, "You are good for her," in a tone that settled the matter without embellishment. Louis asked Annie to marry him on a Sunday in April, 2 days after her 25th birthday, on the porch he had repaired and repainted, with the climbing roses beginning to put out their first new leaves of the season. He had bought a ring in Santa Fe during a supply run the month prior, a plain silver ring with a small turquoise stone, chosen because it seemed right for the place, and for her, practical and beautiful without being showy about either quality. He went down on one knee on the solid porch boards he had set himself, and Annie looked at him with an expression that was all the way open, no reserve left in it, bright and full and certain. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and stood up, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him, and the April sun was warm on the porch, and the roses were budding, and somewhere in the barn cutter made a disgruntled sound that neither of them paid any attention to. They married in June of 1883 at the Methodist Church in Red Rock Crossing, with Ernesto standing up with Louis and Maria standing up with Annie, and the Rodriguez boys scrubbed pink and extremely uncomfortable in their good shirts, and Patterson the lawyer having ridden up from Santa Fe for the occasion at Annie's written invitation, which he accepted with clear pleasure and the happy expression of a man who likes to see good outcomes. The ceremony was simple and direct, and the vows were the traditional ones, and Louis meant every word of every line with a completeness that surprised him with its clarity. He had not known a person could feel this certain about anything, and the feeling was something he wanted to mark and keep carefully, like a landmark on a known trail. The reception was held in the Rodriguez yard, which was larger than the church hall and smelled better, and Maria had cooked enough food for twice the number of people present, which was exactly the right amount. There was music from a fiddle player, who was Ernesto's cousin, and a second man who played guitar and sang in Spanish and English interchangeably, and Louis danced with his wife on the packed earth under the cottonwood tree that had been growing in the Rodriguez yard since before the annexation, and Annie danced with the ease of someone who did everything without wasted motion. And her hair was down for the first time he had seen it fully down, and it caught the early summer light, and he thought he was quite possibly the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory, and possibly all adjacent territories as well. They went home to the homestead that evening as the long summer dusk was going golden over the hills. Annie had put new curtains in the bedroom window, made of pale yellow cotton, and they moved softly in the evening breeze, and the whole house had the quality of a place that had been loved into rightness over time. Louis stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it, the solid adobe walls, the repaired porch, the roses climbing the railing, the second room he had built onto the back that was now a proper study for Annie's books, the barn behind where Cutter stood companionably with Annie's mare Duchess. Annie came to stand beside him and slipped her hand into his, and they stood there together in the doorway for a long moment looking at what they had. "I have a confession," she said. He looked at her. "When I opened that door and found you on my porch with a match in your hand," she said, "I was terrified. I did not show it, but I was." She squeezed his hand. "And then you put the match down, and I thought, there is something in this man worth knowing, and I was right." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles slowly, and the evening was warm around them. "I am very glad you opened the door," he said. "So am I," she said. "So am I." The years that followed were the kind that people who have lived through harder ones learn to hold with both hands. Louis Sawyer officially registered as a co-claimant on the Abbott homestead in the autumn of 1883, and by that time He and Annie had come to an arrangement about the property that satisfied both their practical and personal instincts. The land was hers by original right and intent, and he worked it with her as a partner in the full sense of the word, equal voice, equal labor, equal ownership of what they built together. He filed the paperwork with the land office in Albuquerque, and the clerk who processed it made no particular comment, and the land was formally recorded as the Abbott Sawyer Homestead, though everyone who knew them called it the Abbott Place, and Lewis had no objection to that at all. He took on a small contract with the same surveying work he had done years before, working for a new territorial survey effort that was mapping the water rights along the Rio Grande tributaries. The work took him away from the homestead 3 or 4 days at a time, no more, and he found it suited him in the same way it had always suited him: the physical reading of landscape, the careful documentation of what was actually there rather than what someone wished were there. He was honest in his work, which was not something every surveyor in the territory could say, and his reputation for accuracy spread gradually through the community of people who needed accurate survey work done, which was a great many people. Annie's homestead claim reached its 5-year prove-up date in the spring of 1887, at which point she applied for and received the final patent on the 160 acres from the General Land Office, a document that arrived by post in a thick official envelope, and that she held in her hands for a full minute before she said anything. What she said was Lewis's name, very quietly, and he looked up from where he was repairing a harness at the kitchen table and saw her face and came around and put his arms around her from behind, and they stood together looking at the patent document with the official government seal and the legal description of the land. And it was one of those moments that does not require words to fully contain. The cattle herd had grown by then to 40 head, and Lewis had added a proper corral with working chutes that made the annual branding and sorting considerably less chaotic. The garden was larger than Annie's original planting, and they had added an apple orchard along the south slope, 6 trees that were only beginning to bear, but that in 4 or 5 more years would be producing seriously. The second room Lewis had added to the house had been joined by a third, which was now a nursery, because Annie was pregnant by the autumn of 1884 with their first child. Their son was born in February of 1885, in the bedroom with the yellow curtains, with Maria Rodriguez in attendance in her capacity as the community's most experienced midwife, and Lewis waiting in the kitchen with Ernesto because Maria had told him firmly and without ambiguity to wait in the kitchen. The sound of the baby crying for the first time was the most significant sound Lewis had ever heard, and when Maria opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he walked into the room where Annie was sitting up in bed with a red-faced, furious, perfect infant in her arms, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both and felt something so large and specific and unprecedented that it sat in his chest without words for a long time. "He looks angry," Lewis said at last. "He looks like he has been through something difficult," Annie said, with considerable equanimity, given that she was the one who had done the work. "I think he will settle." They named him Thomas, after Annie's father, Thomas Robert Sawyer, and he settled into the world with a will and a pair of lungs that could be heard clearly from the barn. Ernesto and Maria came the next day with food and blankets, and the kind of practical assistance that makes the first weeks of parenthood survivable, and Maria held Thomas with the expertise of a woman who had delivered a very large number of babies, and rocked him with the particular rhythm that quieted him almost immediately. And Lewis watched this with the deep gratitude of a man who understands he has been given a community as well as a wife. Thomas grew up in the sun and dust of the New Mexico territory with the easy confidence of a child who is deeply loved and kept sufficiently busy to stay out of serious trouble. He was dark-haired like his mother and had his father's eyes, which were gray and careful and observant, and by the time he was 4, he was following Lewis around the property in the mornings with the solemn intensity of a small boy conducting a formal inspection. Annie became pregnant again in the spring of 1887, and their second child, a daughter they named Clara Ruth, arrived in December of that year, healthy and loud, and with her mother's auburn hair already visible at birth, which made everyone present laugh. Lewis held her in the first hour of her life, and thought that this was, in fact, the best possible reason a person could have for having stopped moving long enough to find the right place. The homestead in those years was not only a property, but a center of a small community of people who had found common cause in the territory. The Rodriguezes remained their closest neighbors and dearest friends, and there were others who had come to know the Abbott Sawyer place as a reliable point of welcome and practical assistance. There was a widow named Helen Marsh, who had taken up a claim 3 miles to the north, and who came to rely on Annie's knowledge of the land and Lewis's practical skills during her first difficult year. There was a young Mexican man named Tomas Reyes who had come up from Chihuahua and needed work and references, and Lewis hired him on as a hand without particular ceremony and sent him to Ernesto Rodriguez for the remainder of his social integration into the community. Lewis thought sometimes about Gerald Holt, who was by then presumably doing his work in El Paso or somewhere further along the same trajectory, and the thinking had no particular heat to it, not forgiveness exactly, more like distance. He had made a choice on a Thursday evening in September of 1882, standing on a porch with a match between his fingers, and the choice had cost him $40 and changed everything else, and he found that the trade was so obviously correct that he could only feel a mild, abstracted gratitude toward the particular set of circumstances that had made it possible. He had been, in the end, the kind of man who put the match down, and this was not a small thing to know about yourself. The nights at the Abbott Sawyer homestead in those years had a quality that Lewis, who had spent a great many nights in a great many places, recognized as singular and irreplaceable. After the children were in bed and the work of the day was done, he and Annie would often sit on the porch, the same porch he had once nearly destroyed, and watch the dark settle over the hills and the stars come out over the desert. The climbing roses were fully established by then, climbing the full height of the porch posts and spreading along the railing, and in the summers their scent mixed with the sage and the juniper smoke from the stove. And the whole combination was something Lewis had no words for except that it was home, which was a word he had gone 28 years without being able to apply to anything specific, and now could not imagine being without. Annie would lean against him on the porch step, her head finding the angle of his shoulder that fit it perfectly, and they would talk or not talk with equal ease, and occasionally she would say something so precise and clear-eyed about whatever she was thinking about. The land, the cattle market, what Thomas had said that morning, her thoughts about a book she was reading, her satisfaction or frustration with some aspect of the year's work, that Lewis would be struck fresh by the particular quality of her intelligence, its directness and practicality and occasional unexpected flights toward the philosophical. He told her so once in the awkward, earnest way he had when he was saying something that mattered. He told her that he found her endlessly remarkable and that he thought about this often and that he was not sure he would ever be fully accustomed to it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I feel the same way about you, Lewis. I have for a long time." And he held her there on the porch under the stars while the desert breathed around them, and the roses moved in the night breeze, and from inside the house came the small sounds of children sleeping, and the whole of it, the years of work, the narrow near miss on a September evening, the choice to put the match down, the decision to stay, the long careful courtship, the marriage, the children, the community, the land, all of it came together in that moment into something complete and sufficient and entirely right. The life a man can make when he stops moving long enough to see what is actually in front of him. The Abbott Sawyer homestead received its final land patent from the federal government in the spring of 1888, and Lewis rode into Redrock Crossing to register the co-title at the county land office on a bright, warm morning in April with Thomas on the horse in front of him, pointing at things on the road and asking Lewis to identify them, which Lewis did patiently and with considerable pleasure. Lewis Sawyer was 34 years old that April, and he had a wife and 2 children and 40 head of cattle and 6 apple trees, and a home he had helped build with his own hands on land that belonged to no one who was not willing to earn it. And in the land office, the clerk stamped the papers and handed them back and said, "Everything looks in order, Mr. Sawyer." And Lewis folded the papers carefully and put them in his jacket pocket next to his heart, which was beating steadily and with purpose, as it had been for some years now, and rode home. Annie was in the garden when he came up the road, on her knees among the early spring plantings with her sleeves rolled and her hair catching the afternoon sun, and she looked up when she heard Cutter's hooves on the road and shielded her eyes with one hand and stood up to meet them. Thomas launched himself off the horse before Lewis had fully dismounted, which caused Lewis a minor cardiac event, but the boy landed running and arrived at his mother's side at speed, and announced with great authority that they had gone to town and seen 3 horses and a dog and a man with a very large hat. Annie laughed that full warm laugh she had and caught her son by the shoulders and looked up over his head at Lewis. "Well," she said. Lewis pulled the papers from his jacket pocket. "All in order," he said. She smiled at him across the few feet of spring earth between them, and it was the same smile, the full, unguarded one, the one he had first seen across a fire in the open country south of Santa Fe, the one that had never grown familiar in the sense of losing its effect on him, only familiar in the sense of being the thing he most wanted to see at the end of every day and the beginning of every morning. He walked across the garden to her, and she met him halfway, and he folded her into his arms, papers and all, and she pressed her face against his chest, and they stood together in the April garden with Thomas already running toward the barn to report to Cutter and the chickens about the hat, and the smell of new earth and young plants all around them, and the mountains blue and clear in the distance, and the homestead solid and alive and theirs behind them. Later that spring, 2 things happened that completed the picture of the life they were building in a way that felt, to Lewis, entirely intentional in the way that only the best things feel intentional after the fact, as though the universe had been working toward this particular arrangement for some time and was simply being patient with the people involved. The first was that Tomas Reyes, their hired hand, married a young woman from the Rodriguez extended family, and the wedding was held at the Abbott Sawyer homestead at Annie's invitation, and the yard was full of people and music, and the smell of Maria Rodriguez's cooking, and Lewis stood near the fence in the early summer evening watching it all, and felt with a specific and grateful clarity that he was part of something larger than himself. A web of people and land and history that had been being woven long before he arrived and would continue being woven long after, and that he was genuinely and irrevocably woven into it. The second thing was that Annie told him she was pregnant again, in October of 1888, which she did at the kitchen table in the morning over coffee in the direct manner she always brought to significant news, and Lewis set his cup down and looked at her with the same look he suspected he had been wearing since the very first morning he sat at that table, the one he could not seem to help and did not want to. "Are you happy about it?" she said, studying him with those precise dark eyes. "Annie," he said, "I am the happiest man I have ever known." She leaned across the table and kissed him once, warm and certain, and sat back and picked up her coffee. Their third child, another son, was born in June of 1889, and they named him Daniel, and he arrived in the world with considerably more tranquility than Thomas had managed, regarding his parents with an expression of mild assessment that Maria Rodriguez said meant he would be the easy one, which proved entirely accurate. In the autumn of that same year, Lewis completed the last portion of the property improvement that he had been planning since the first winter, a proper smokehouse behind the main house, built of the same adobe and timber as the original structure, fitted with proper ventilation and a good door. It was not a large building, but it was solid and useful, and he was proud of it in the particular quiet way he felt proud of things that were built to last. He stood beside Annie when it was finished, looking at it in the low autumn sun, and she said, "It is very good work, Louis. It will keep us in good smoked meat through the winters," he said. "Yes," she said, "and in 40 years when Thomas's children are using it, they will know it was built well." He thought about that for a moment. 40 years. Thomas's children, the ongoing, forward-moving fact of a life being built rather than merely spent. "I think about that sometimes," he said. "What? What stays?" He put an arm around her shoulders. "What you build, that goes on after you. I spent a lot of years not building anything, and now I think about this house and the orchard and the children, whether they will know who built it and why." Annie turned to look at him with an expression of complete warmth. "They will know," she said. "I will make sure of it, but more than that, they will feel it. In the way a home feels when it has been made with intention. That does not go away." He held her close in the cooling air of the autumn afternoon, and she was right, and he knew she was right, and the knowing of it was deep and clean and without qualification. The New Mexico Territory was approaching the decade of its statehood application. It would not achieve it until 1912, as matters developed, but the movement was already building in those years, a growing sense that the territory had earned its full standing and was ready for it. Louis participated in the local discussions about this with the moderate and measured engagement of a man who has learned to care about the place he lives in, attending the township meetings in Red Rock Crossing, serving 2 terms on the local school board committee, contributing to the fund for the new school building that went up in 1891. His survey work had grown into a small but solid practice by then. He had taken on a partner, a younger man named Will Ortega, who had trained as a civil engineer and whose skills complemented Louis's practical field knowledge well. They worked under the name Sawyer and Ortega Survey, and their reputation in the territory was for accuracy and honesty, both of which remained somewhat rarer commodities than they should have been. Annie's homestead had become, by the early 1890s, a working ranch in the full sense of the word. The cattle herd was now over 100 head, and she had hired on 2 additional hands besides Tomas, and the branding days in the spring were genuine community events that drew the Rodriguez family and their extended circle, and several neighboring ranchers. Annie managed the operation with the same focused competence she had always brought to everything, and Louis, who handled the survey work and the infrastructure and the marketing of cattle at the stockyards in Albuquerque, had a full and satisfying partnership with her that ran on mutual respect and shared purpose, and the daily accumulated evidence of 2 people who were genuinely well matched in every dimension that matters. They had their arguments, because they were both people with strong views, and neither of them was inclined to defer for the sake of peace. They argued about cattle management, and about money, and occasionally about Louis's tendency to take on more survey contracts than he could comfortably complete, and Annie's tendency to add to the workload of the homestead without fully accounting for what she was already carrying. They argued loudly and directly in the way of people who trust each other enough not to soften things, and they resolved their arguments in the same spirit, directly, without extended silences or accumulated resentments, because neither of them had the patience for that kind of waste. Thomas, growing up watching this, absorbed it in ways that showed in his own character a directness and fairness in his dealings with other people, a practical intelligence, an instinct for what was worth standing firm on and what was worth letting go. Clara was different from her brother in the specific and lovely way that children from the same family can be entirely themselves. She had Annie's auburn hair and a natural gift for the kind of social intelligence that makes people feel seen and welcome, and she was by 9 years old managing the community relationships of the homestead with an ease that made Annie laugh with pure maternal delight. Daniel, the youngest, was steady and observant and deeply attached to the livestock in a way that suggested his future was in animal management, which proved accurate. Lewis was 40 years old in 1894, and Annie was 37, and they sat together on the porch on his birthday with the children in bed and a bottle of good whiskey that Ernesto had given them as a gift, and Annie poured 2 small glasses and handed one to Lewis. "I want to say something," she said. He turned to look at her. "12 years ago," she said, "a man with a coal oil can came to burn down my house." A slight pause, the corner of her mouth moving. "I am very glad I stayed home from Bible study." He laughed, a full, genuine laugh that he was no longer surprised to find came easily to him. "I am very glad you opened the door," he said. She raised her glass. He raised his. They drank. The desert was dark and enormous around them, and the stars were out in the particular extravagance of the high country sky, and the roses climbed the porch railing in full summer bloom, and from inside the house came the small sleeping sounds of 3 children who would grow up knowing that the place they lived had been built with purpose and love, and the specific kind of tenacity that keeps a match unlit on a September evening, when the world is asking a person to be worse than they are. Lewis Sawyer put his arm around his wife and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the porch held them both solidly, as it was built to do. And the night went on around them, vast and full of stars, and the life they had made together was here and whole and entirely, enduringly, irreversibly theirs. Many years later, when Thomas Sawyer was grown and had a family of his own, and had taken on the primary management of the ranch, he would sometimes find his father in the early evenings sitting on the old porch with his mother, both of them gray now and slower, but no less themselves, watching the light go off the hills in the way it did in the autumn, purple and gold and enormous. His father's hand would be in his mother's, and they would be talking or not talking with the ease of people who have said everything that needed saying over decades, and have found that the silence between them is as good as the words. Thomas would stop at the edge of the yard and not interrupt, because he understood, with the understanding of a person raised in the full presence of something real, that what he was looking at was the center of everything. Not just the homestead, not just the land and the buildings and the cattle and the orchard, but the thing that made all of it mean something. The choice made on a September evening long before his birth to put a match down on a porch railing and walk through a door toward a life worth living. Lewis and Annie Sawyer grew old together on the land she had claimed, and they had proved up together, in the house that had been built with necessity and care, and was extended over the years with love and intention. They watched their children grow and leave and come back with families of their own, and they worked the land for as long as they could work it, and when the working slowed, they watched over it with the proprietary pride of people who know what things cost and value them accordingly. The climbing roses bloomed every summer along the porch railing, tied back each spring with strips of cloth, and the apple orchard on the south slope produced abundantly, and the smokehouse stood solid and squared for decades, and the homestead was known in the county for what it had always been, a place built on stubbornness and honesty, and the willingness of 2 people to choose each other at the beginning and keep choosing every day after, which is the whole of it, really. The whole of what any life worth having amounts to. The match stayed on the railing, the door had opened, and everything good had followed,